Michael asked me just before we started this session, said, how much will you pay me in order to introduce the next speaker? The next speaker offered to pay me to not introduce him. This is a money-making proposition. Frederick W. Stancliff. Today is his birthday. And he's not bad looking for a man of 90. He's in pretty good shape. It is a true pleasure and a privilege to have the opportunity to introduce him. I love him greatly. His family, in fact, I loved him enough that I married into him. In fact, when they first moved here and had been attending here for a little while, Bill Klein asked me, says, what do you think of Fred Stancliff? I said, I don't really know, but I do like one of his daughters. And she is the one I married. But he's married to Reba Stancliff, who was a Greek student of mine. I will not mention her grade. She is still holding that against me. But they have 4 children, 3 daughters, and a son, faithful members of the Lord's church. We love and appreciate this family. They have done a tremendous job. He has served for a number of years as one of the elders of this congregation. And, Brother Gallagher and Brother Brantley, in fact, the Brantleys, for that matter, going back to Hairston Brantley, Brother Kozad, Brother George M. Prosser, and so many other great godly men served the eldership here over the years. And it's, as has been noted, one of the reasons they are steadfast in the faith. Brother Fred has also served as a gospel preacher, and he knows both sides of the equation. He's been there. He was a student of the Sunset School of Preaching back before Sunset went wacky, and is an opponent of that school now that it is wacky. But he is a diligent student of the Bible, has a great knowledge of the Scriptures, and is constantly working and studying. If I could just get him straightened out on certain aspects of the book of Revelation, I think we'll get along just fine. Anyway, Brother Fred Stancliff.
How do you follow an introduction like that? With fear and trembling. Anytime you have your son-in-law introduce you, you're fighting for anything you can hold on to. Seriously, we love Daniel, and we think highly of the work he's doing and encourage him to continue doing it. As I was getting ready to eat breakfast this morning, the family was gathered there around the table, and suddenly they began singing Happy Birthday. And I realized, yes, it is. Another one's gone by. And then I got to thinking about it, and I come to the realization that during this past week, there's been a great deal of consideration about the age of one of our speakers, namely one with a first name named Dub. And I thought, is it possible that I'm older than this speaker that they're making fun of? So I went into my office and pulled out a few of my lecture books that I have from past lectures. They usually have a biographical sketch of the speakers, and I thought, well, I'll find out how old Dub is and make a comparison. You know, his birthday is not in any of them that I looked at. Is it possible they didn't keep birth records back at that time? Now, I sincerely appreciate being able to speak on this lectureship, and each year those of us at Bellview look forward to renewing our fellowship with the speakers and likewise the visitors that come year after year. My lesson today is entitled Evil Leaders, and is based upon a text in Micah 3, verses 1 through 3. As I thought about how to approach this subject, how do you talk about evil leaders? They're all around us. They're worldwide. And where do you begin and where do you stop? And so I thought maybe today we might think about what the position was that Micah was in his day, as he had evil leaders, and as this text that was assigned to me indicates. So Michael had to deal, or Micah, not Michael. I'll keep making that slip probably all the way along. But Micah had to deal with corrupt leaders in his day, much the very same as we do today. But how did these evil leaders get into the positions that they were in? And I thought I might approach it from that direction. I'm going to go back to the beginning at the time of creation and follow through trying to pick out selected leaders to show us the characteristics of some of those leaders and what they have done to the people of their age, how God treated them and gave them the rightful action, whether it be good or bad, as far as they were concerned. Do we have any evil leaders in our country today? You bet we do. All you have to do is read the daily newspaper or pick up any of the current literature that's distributed from a political sense, or if you turn your television on, you don't have to listen very long before you find out, yes, we do have some evil leaders today. And so I want to take us first to the Old Testament and consider what was taking place back at that time. I said I'd do that first, but let's examine the text that was assigned first, because I do want you to associate that with what Micah was doing in our lesson as well. In Micah 3, 1 through 3, we read as follows: "And I said, Hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, and ye princes of Israel. Is it not for you to know judgment, who hate the good and love the evil, who pluck their skin from off them, and their flesh from off their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people, and they flay the skin from off them, and they break their bones, and chop them into pieces, as for the pot and flesh within the cauldron." How would you approach that text? Sounds like a bunch of cannibals. Homer Haley made a comment on it in this way. He said Micah is directing his staff at the rulers, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, rulers over Judah in general and over Jerusalem in particular. It is their responsibility to know and practice justice in their role. But they have betrayed the trust in a disgraceful way. The prophet charges them with being cannibalistic in their very nature. Instead of ministering justice, they pull the skin off the people and cut the flesh off their bones. Micah apparently is speaking specifically to the judges of his day. If any of the leaders of the people of that day should have known the law and likewise administered it fairly, it should have been these judges. Whether or not these individuals were actually physically skinning the people, or whether they were figuratively skinning the people, the reaction to it, the result of it, was not very helpful. And as we consider that, then, keep that in mind as we move to the Old Testament, to the time of creation. Throughout the whole creation, as recorded in the first chapter of Genesis, we see that God created everything good. It's in Genesis 2:17 that we see the first mention of evil. In that text we see, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." At that time, mankind was not evil. God had instructed them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They had followed his instructions. And it should be noted that from the creation, God has always given man freedom of choice. Contrary to Calvinistic doctrine, mankind is not born in sin. Neither does mankind inherit the sins of the fathers. Consider with me a couple texts. First, Deuteronomy 24, verse 16. "The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin." Ezekiel 18, 19 and 20. "Yet say ye, Why? Doth not the son bear the iniquity of the father? When the son hath done that which is lawful and just and right, and hath kept all the statutes, and hath done them, he shall surely live. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him." It did not take very long for evil leaders to make their appearance in the Scriptures. And so we'll now consider some of those evil leaders from the Old Testament times. The first one I want to mention is found in Genesis 3, named Satan. As we consider him, he appeared in the form of a serpent. He tempted Eve by lying to her. He told her that she would not surely die if she ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She fell to the temptation and sinned. And likewise she gave some of the fruit to her husband, and Adam likewise sinned. It is evident from this account, and I'd like to kind of make a mental note of this point as I pass on from here later. The point I'm wanting to obtain from this, it's evident from this that one of the problems with evil leaders is that they lie and cause others to sin. We also see that God will punish those who are evil leaders, and not only those, but also those who follow after them. We next move through the period of time down to the time of the flood. And as we look to evil leaders in the days of Noah, in Genesis 6, verses 5 through 7, we read the following. "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was upon evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. And the Lord said, I'll destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." You recall how only Noah and his family were saved from the flood which God used to destroy man. And in Genesis 6, verses 8 through 13, we read the following. "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Once again, we see the principle that I mentioned earlier. Evil leaders of the earth do so through their own choice. They sin and cause their followers to sin as well. As a result, God will destroy the evil leaders and those who follow after them. And he did so in Noah's day with a worldwide flood. Looking on down the process of time to the Egyptian pharaohs, I call your attention to the 1st and 5th chapters of the book of Exodus. We read about evil leaders of the Egyptians. An Egyptian Pharaoh, who knew not Joseph, became fearful that the Israelites would multiply and take over the land. And therefore he made slaves out of the Israelites. He ordered his men to beat the Israelites, to get them to work harder. To stop the Israelites from multiplying, he ordered the midwives to drown the male children of the Israelites. And to make more difficult, he ordered the Israelites to search for the necessary straw to make the bricks that they were ordered to make. In spite of these evil actions, the Israelites continued to multiply and grow stronger. But God was aware of the persecution of the Israelites, and he appointed Moses to lead his people out of bondage. God used 10 plagues to enable Moses to deal with the Pharaoh. And finally, after 10 plagues, the Egyptians let the Israelites go. As they were going across the Red Sea, God allowed Moses to perform a miracle by which the waters of the Red Sea came back together after Israel had gone through in safety, and they drowned the evil leaders and those who followed after them. Let's move on down through the Old Testament a little further, to the time of the kings of Israel. After taking over the promised land that God had promised to Israel, the Israelites became dissatisfied because they did not have a king like the nations around them. God had warned Israel about the dangers of having a king. However, contrary to Samuel's wishes, God allowed Israel to have a king in response to the request. As history has proven, however, all 19 of the kings of the north were evil leaders, and 11 of the 19 on the southern kingdom were evil leaders. As a result of the influence of the evil leaders of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into Assyrian captivity about 722 BC, and subsequently the southern kingdom of Israel was taken into Babylonian captivity in about 586 BC. Once again, God punished both the evil leaders of Israel and also those who sinned by following after their evil ways. There are many other leaders in the Old Testament that we could point out, but these should be sufficient to allow you to see the principles that I'm trying to indicate here. We'll close our study of the Old Testament with a passage found in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 40, and I read as follows. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail to tell me of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, and of David also, and of Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed violent in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might have a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, they were slain by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And these, all having a good report, through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. We leave the Old Testament now and move on to evil leaders of the New Testament. And as we do so, it's evident that this parade of evil leaders is continuing. as Satan continued to work through those who rejected God and his principles, we're going to note some of the evil leaders who fell to his evil devices and sinned by doing so. The first one I call your attention to is Herod, king of Judea. Jesus was born in the days of Herod, the king of Judea. We see this in Matthew 2, verse 1, and Luke 1, verse 5. When Herod heard that the wise men were looking for a newborn child, which they called the King of the Jews, he became troubled. Obviously, he didn't want to lose his job as position of the King of the Jews. Herod lied to the wise men from the east and told them to let him know when they found the child, because he wanted to worship him. To protect Jesus, God told the wise men to return home by a different route, which they did. He then informed Joseph and Mary to take Jesus to Egypt, as we see in Matthew 2, verses 7 through 15. But in Matthew 2, verse 16, we see Herod's reaction of pride. Listen to what that text shows. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. As a result of Herod's pride and his fear of losing his position of power, this evil leader ordered the murder of untold numbers of babies. Does that remind you of anything today? What about abortion and the unborn children that are being slaughtered by the millions? We'll talk more about our own time later. We move to the Jews of Jesus' day. Although Jesus was tempted during his lifetime in all points as we are, and yet without sin, as we see in Hebrews 4:15, Satan tempted him, but he would not yield to Satan's temptation. The Jewish leaders persecuted him unmercifully and eventually caused him to be crucified, but Jesus did not resist. The prophet Isaiah prophetically foretold of Jesus' persecution in Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. Keep in mind, Jesus set the perfect example for us in resisting evil leaders. Let's look at a different individual now in the New Testament. Individual named Saul, or Paul as he was later called. When we first read about Paul, we see in Acts 7:58 that he was one of the evil leaders that were assisting in stoning a Christian named Stephen. At that time, he was called Saul and was very active in persecuting Christians. Paul described his former life as an evil leader in the book of Philippians chapter 3, verse 4 through 6. In that text it says, "Though I might have confidence in the flesh, if any man thinketh that he hath, whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more." Listen to this list of things. "Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, an Hebrew of Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, and touching the righteousness which was in the law, blameless." In Acts chapter 9, verse 1 through 22, and Acts 22, verses 1 through 21, we read of Paul's conversion from Judaism. Jesus appeared miraculously to Saul on the road to Damascus, and Saul was blinded and taken into Damascus, where he fasted and prayed for 3 days. God sent Ananias to meet with Saul, and upon his arrival, Ananias put his hands upon Saul. Saul received his sight, and Ananias informed him of God's plans for him and encouraged him to be baptized. Saul did so, and soon thereafter he began preaching Christ. In the case of Saul, or later as he became known as Paul, we see that evil leaders can be changed. They can sometimes be converted from their error and even become useful as Christian leaders. Paul made a dramatic change in his life from being a persecutor to one of the persecuted. In 2 Corinthians 11, verses 5 through 33, Paul defended his apostleship and listed some of the persecutions that he had received. He suffered much for the cause of Christ. We move now to an individual named Felix. And in the case of Felix, we look to Acts 24, verses 24 through 27, and read as follows. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning his faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way, for this time, when I have a more convenient season, I will call for thee. He actually hoped that he would be given money by Paul, that he might loose him, wherefore he sent for him the sooner. As we look further, he eventually left Paul bound for another individual to take care of and prosecute or persecute Saul further. From that account, we see where some of the ways that evil leaders work. First, in the case of the Jews, they accused Paul falsely. Then Felix, the Roman governor, listened to Paul and was shaken by his words. But he was not honest enough to act upon the truth that Paul taught. Also, Felix hoped that Paul would bribe him to get his freedom. When this failed, after 2 years, Felix left Paul bound for Porcius Festus to take care of. We move now to an individual named Diotrephes. One of the former speakers had made mention of an individual that called my attention to the man named Diotrephes, because he was speaking of someone that was in a congregation that he knew of that was similar. In the book of 3 John, verses 9 through 11, John discusses an individual named Diotrephes who was an evil leader in the church. He says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loved to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. For he that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. This evil leader lacked the hospitality that every Christian should have. He lacked love for his fellow man. He was arrogant, malicious, and selfish. He was acting without the authority of the Scriptures. No congregation of the Lord's church needs individuals like Diotrephes. In fact, that congregation should have cast him out of the church instead of letting him stop others from doing good. But let's move now to the current generation. We've considered evil leaders both in the Old and New Testaments for a period of time, but what about our own generation? We'll now consider a few of those evil leaders. First of all, evil leaders from other nations. Within my lifetime, and I'm really not that old, we've seen World War II, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, and the current wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of the evil leaders in other countries which have led the United States into war we'll now consider. And the first of these, I think, is logically Adolf Hitler. Perhaps one of the best known leaders of the evil leaders was Adolf Hitler. He was an evil dictator who ruled Germany for a period of about 12 years, which included invasions into the surrounding countries in an effort to gain worldwide power. His alliances with Italy and Japan led into a worldwide war between nations which led to millions of deaths. His hatred for the Jews and his efforts to annihilate them led to thousands of deaths in German concentration camps. And just as a sidelight to that, even on the news today, there are those people who say, no, there was no Holocaust. There was no persecution of the Jews. That's just a figment of your imagination. We move now to Saddam Hussein. He was the president of Iraq before his death during the Iraq War. He was a well-known and hated dictator. He loved his position of power and was willing even to use chemical weapons to kill those who would oppose him. He was caught by the United States forces during the Iraq War. Later, he was convicted of crimes by the Iraqi court and was hanged. And because of the war against Hussein's evil forces, thousands of America's young men and women died. Another individual, you're well familiar with this name, Osama bin Laden. He was well known as one of the terrorist leaders of the Al-Qaeda forces in Afghanistan. Although he is thought to be one of the ones who planned the attack on the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City on September 21, 2001. In that attack, thousands of people were killed at the Twin Towers as they were destroyed by two commercial aircraft. The aircraft had been commandeered by members of the Al-Qaeda forces and deliberately flown into the towers. The United States declared war on terrorism and has been trying to capture or kill Osama bin Laden since the towers were destroyed. He is a terrorist who seemingly had no concern for the destruction of the lives of innocent people. We move now to evil leaders in our own country, and we do have those. They can be found in our governments, our judicial systems, our educational systems, our work systems, our places where we work, our churches, and our families. But let's look first at governmental evil leaders. I worked for the state of Florida for 25 years before I retired. I was auditing many political leaders in the counties and the state of Florida, along with others that worked with me. I met some that were very good leaders. I met some that were the opposite. It was not unusual for me to find fraud as I audited the records of the courthouses and like buildings. Whether it's on the federal level or the state level or the county level, corruption in government is a constant problem. For example, it's unusual to read a daily newspaper or to listen to the evening news on TV without hearing of another politician who has been arrested, indicted, or convicted of some sort of governmental corruption. In our last election, it cost millions of dollars to pay for a campaign on the federal level. Since few people have that kind of money to spend on their own election, it requires many donations from other sources in order to get elected. Whether the donations come from the businesses or individuals, the ones who donate the money generally expect favors in return. It sometimes involves bribery to get certain legislation passed. In some cases, dishonesty in the actual election process occurs. Have you ever heard of lost ballot boxes? Did they just happen to fall on one side? Sometimes our legislators pass bills that will be favorable to their families and to themselves. Some laws, such as those favoring abortion or homosexuality, are unscriptural. In such cases, Christians have to decide whether they're going to obey God or to obey man. Acts 5:29. Evil leaders in our judicial systems. Just as it was in the days of Micah the prophet, We find dishonesty in our court systems. Bribery or immorality may occur in order for a defendant to get favorable verdicts or favorable sentences of the judges. Even after a conviction is obtained, it may take over 10 years for a criminal court to start that individual in serving his sentence. This is especially true when the one convicted has enough money to pay for the best lawyers in the country. We move through the time of educational systems, and our educational systems are corrupt, just like the judicial systems. You know that things aren't well when you hear teachers teaching that which is contrary to the Bible. And as such, our children are in danger as a result. As we look to the leaders in the church, I want to emphasize this in particular because it's so true to our situation. Evil leaders in the church, as you are well aware, and other speakers have commented on it as well, have caused much division in recent years. My wife and I remember vividly of the times we were able to travel across the country and worship any place as we traveled. If it had a sign out in front that said Church of Christ, we were assured by just the fact of the sign being there that those people would be worshiping God in the correct way. That's no longer true, as you well know. In the church, there are many who do not respect biblical authority as they ought to. They don't respect authority for the qualifications of elders as they are appointed. When they hire preachers, they're not looking to biblical authority for the qualifications of that individual in many cases. Bible teachers as well. And the actions of their members even are suspect. When unqualified members or when unqualified men are appointed to the eldership, confusion generally results. Congregations may hire unqualified men as preachers and may even fire qualified preachers. I think maybe that might touch home with a few as well in our audience. In my lesson today, thus far, I've noted numerous instances throughout the centuries where God has punished evil leaders as well as those who followed their evil ways. Now let's make an application and you see the reason why I cited these things as we went along. The results of things that have happened in just the last few years. We've seen false teachers such as Dave Miller, for example, teaching false doctrines as far as elder evaluation and reaffirmation. After all, if you can destroy the eldership, you can take over the congregation. And as a result of this, then, we ought to seriously be disturbed when we hear people that are standing for this false practice. But we must not allow ourselves to be caught up in that corrupt error. We must remain faithful regardless of the cost. We have every reason, as we've seen from these illustrations in the Old and New Testament, that God will punish these evil leaders and those who follow after them. As we begin to draw our lesson to a close, I want to cite some of the characteristics of evil leaders that we've already talked some about and call your attention to them. From our previous study, we've seen that some of these evil leaders are liars. Some hate good and love evil. Some are dishonest. Some are greedy. Some are selfish. Some are full of pride. And some are lovers of power. Some are unjust. Some are persecutors. Some are murderers. Some are false teachers. Some will accept bribes. Some are not hospitable. Some are arrogant. Some are corrupt. Some are immoral. Some are atheistic and have no respect for authority. That's quite a list, isn't it? I think maybe you can recognize one when you see him now after that list. But in conclusion then, let us realize that evil leaders have existed from shortly after the creation, even up to our present time. They will undoubtedly continue until the end of time. But we see in Revelation 21, verse 8, that God has a place prepared for those evil leaders. That text says the fearful and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Keep in mind this particular statement. There could not be evil leaders without evil followers. They would have no power. Don't allow yourself to be one of these followers that's following evil leaders. Thank you for your kind attention.